Some variations give their possessors a competitive advantage. Those with the competitive advantage have the best chance of reproducing and will leave in the next generation a disproportionate number of offspring with that same advantageous trait, right? Because we inherit our traits from our parents. Thus, the proportion of individuals with advantageous traits in the population will increase over time, so long as the trait remains advantageous. So you're going to get a population where the features change gradually over time because that feature gives them a competitive advantage in the environment at a particular time. Notice the environment can change, and what was a good trait to have will become a really bad trait to have, right? Depends on the environment. That's natural selection, right? What a trait does is its function. That's the way we talk about it. When we say a trait is functional, we mean that it provides some kind of advantage in the population. Notice that natural selection is not the only process that drives evolution. First of all, sometimes, actually, we're not in very competitive environments, and you just have lots of variation happen, right? Because the environment isn't particularly competitive. Sometimes you'll have very small populations and you'll have what they call genetic drift. Some traits are connected to other traits, and so the first trait is advantageous, but the second trait, it's kind of, it's neither advantageous or not advantageous, but it gets dragged along by the first trait. So there's nothing in this theory that says that all the traits we have are going to be functional in this sense. Okay, so that's my brief primer on evolution. That's about all I agree with for the narrow evolutionary psychologists. Okay, so I'm disambiguating the target. Back to the real meat of the talk. So who I'm going to call narrow evolutionary psychologists call themselves evolutionary psychologists. They sort of coined this name in 1992 in a book, The Adapted Mind, which was co-edited by Kosmides, Tooby, and Barkow. It's not the only research program that studies the evolution of human and non-human animal psychology, right? You've got sociobiology, you've got behavioral ecology, you've got ethology, you've got a whole bunch of other research programs. Right. And so again, those other research programs, I think they're fine, right? I think clearly if evolution is what sculpted the traits that every organism on the planet has, then evolution is going to have some kind of explanatory role in any kind of cognitive trait that I have, right? So, that program seems to me highly plausible. Still in all, the problematic methods, I'm going to talk about these in more detail, of narrow evolutionary psychology tend to seep into some of the other research programs. So this is what I found when I was looking at this vervet monkey toy study, was although it wasn't really evolutionary psychology because they were focusing on vervet monkeys, and Kosmides and Tooby, they only ever look at human evolution, still in all, they were using a whole bunch of the same assumptions. And so there's a distinction, but they bleed into each other, right? It's a bit complicated. And I think that's part of why you get this kind of rhetorical positioning of narrow evolutionary psychology. Because there's this thing that happens where people attack the Kosmides and Tooby program, and Kosmides and Tooby, or their defenders, say, you're just anti-science. You're against all evolutionary psychology, right? Because there's this equivocation between talking about evolutionary psychology just as a descriptive phrase, right? The kind of evolutionary psychology that I think is obvious, and this particular program of a group of people who named themselves evolutionary psychology, right? So you get this kind of equivocation that functions to rhetorically position those people who attack neuroevolutionary psychology as anti-science, right? And so this has bigger implications in the culture wars, right? So, I don't know, I'm Canadian, so it looks a little different from my perspective, but I gather in the United States, in Canada to a bit of an extent as well, there's this characterization of a clash of cultures where you've got a kind of religious culture versus a scientific culture. This is the way things are often characterized. And you'll find sometimes that feminists in particular who have criticized narrow evolutionary psychology are characterized as these kinds of ideologues who are anti-science, anti-progress. Interestingly also, you'll get neuroevolutionary psychologists sort of characterizing their program as presenting the facts, right? They're defending the facts and real science against these value-driven ideologues. Now again, that's kind of taking this early 20th century view of the relationship between facts and values that most philosophers of science now don't really accept. Okay, so some of the central tenets of neuroevolutionary psychology. First is that there's an innate universal human nature. This is a little weird because while they say it's universal and they'll talk about evolutionary psychology being the program to uncover this universal human nature, they treat it as sexually dimorphic. But you don't have a universal human nature, you have two human natures, right? If it's dimorphic, there are two things, right? There's a weird thing going on there. You also get the characterization of the mind as a computer. And it's a computer that's like my laptop, right? It's got a processor, although not a central processor. It's got a video card, it's got an audio card. It's got these little modules that fit together and function to produce behavior like PowerPoint slides. They also think that the human mind evolved in the Pleistocene. So they tend to just focus on the Pleistocene. That's roughly 2.6 million years ago to the Holocene, right, 12,000 years ago. And they call this the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And so this is the environment that they imagine evolutionary processes happening. So just quickly, some of the problems. I'm not going to dwell on these because these are some of the problems, only a handful of the problems that everybody else has been dwelling on repeatedly, right, in the criticisms. So first of all, just like I mentioned on the slide describing natural selection requires variation. You have to have variation in a population if natural selection is going to happen, right? You expect variation. And so how do you get a universal human nature out of that? It's just kind of prima facie surprising. If you've got extremely strong selection pressures in a very narrow environment, you might expect it, right? Also, their account doesn't fit with their account of sexual dimorphism. If I had more time, I'd talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about it now. The mind is a computer, like my laptop. Well, it fights against some of what we know about the brain and the plasticity of the brain. And the various different ways the components of the brain seem to work, right? So some people have said that the brain isn't modular. It's not like you've got little bits that do specific things. It's domain dominant, right? Sometimes you've got little bits that do specific things. Sometimes you've got rather larger amorphous bits that do a whole bunch of kind of vaguely connected things, right? And this laptop model is not a good model for the brain. So it'd be surprising if the mind was like that. Why the Pleistocene, and what do we mean by the Pleistocene? Notice the Pleistocene is not like a single habitat. We're talking about an age where humans managed to populate every continent except for Antarctica. That is not a single habitat, right? What they tend to do is talk about hunter-gatherer societies. But a hunter-gatherer society is not a habitat, right? It's a social thing. It's not a biological thing at all. Hunter-gatherers, I think, from a biological perspective, are omnivores, right? You eat vegetation and you eat various types of meats. Finally, human minds are primate minds. Why wouldn't we look at our closest kin, chimps, bonobos, gorillas? Okay, so those are some of the problems that I just very superficially rehearsed. Again, there's piles of other people who do a much better job than I could. This is a really interesting one. This is the problem of circularity that comes right out of their method. So this is the method according to Cosmides and Tooby, the way you're supposed to engage in theorizing about evolutionary psychology.